everybody. So I'm Tara Kennedy. My current position is as Preventive Conservator at Yale University Library's Preservation Department. I also do consulting work around the United States, also in my spare time. So I kind of wear two hats in that respect. But today I am here to talk to you about mold. Today we're going to talk about moldy myths. And the big myth that I often hear from people is freezing alone will kill mold. People think that if you pop it in the freezer and let it be and then take it out, boom, you're all set. Well, unfortunately, that's not always the case. The truth is, it kind of depends. Is the mold active? Is it inactive? What's it growing on? Can you freeze the item itself? Like, is it truly mold? Maybe it's something else. Will the mold make you sick? Will it ruin the object? Mold is a complex organism, and getting rid of it requires a bit more knowledge about mold itself. So that's what I'm hoping to do today in this webinar, teach you more about mold so you know how to manage it in case you come across it. So what is mold? What isn't mold? How did it get there? What triggers it to grow and spread? What type of damage can it do to your collections? And what is that other white stuff you're seeing that might not actually be mold? And once you've identified it, what do you do about it? Which mitigation strategies work best to tackle the problem? We'll take a look at preventative actions you can take, and we'll also talk about what you can handle in a small to mid-sized institution yourself, and when you should really call in the big guns to help, such as a conservator or a disaster remediation contractor. And it's also very important that we'll talk about health and safety. So what kind of precautions you should take when you're working with mold. So I'll talk about personal protective equipment, shorthand PPE, that kind of PPE you'll need to ensure your health and safety, as well as the health and safety of those around you. So what is mold? Well, first of all, mold is everywhere. Mold spores are ubiquitous. They're found indoors, they're found outdoors. They are part of our environment and actually play a really important role in our ecosystem. Molds exist to digest dead plant and animal matter. So they're kind of like nature's little garbage disposals, digesting and breaking down organic matter. And interestingly enough, mold is not an animal, vegetable, or a mineral. It's in a class all by itself, the kingdom of fungi, or fungi, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And whether you call it mold, fungi, or mildew, it's all the same thing. It's mold. So as collection care professionals, we're mostly concerned with sac fungi. It's a class of slime mold. The conidia from these molds, that's what they're showing there in the picture there, those little dots that are on top of that flower-like looking aspergillus piece there. So molds like aspergillus and penicillium, they're released into the air, the conidia or the spores, and they can be carried by wind, water, and other living beings. And they are asexual, which means they reproduce all by themselves without needing to be fertilized. So that's why the removal of mold spores, in other words, cleaning, is so important. If there aren't any spores there, the mold can't spread. So the conidia or spores are specially designed for survival. They will only grow where they have a chance of survival, which means they need the right food and environment. Spores and conidia have incredibly thick cell walls that have to be penetrated in order to fully kill them. Dormant conidia or spores can survive extreme environments like freezing, extreme dryness, extreme heat. Dormant conidia can remain viable for over 20 years, waiting for the right environment to germinate, which is why, again, removal is the best way to get rid of mold and prevent it from reproducing on your objects in the first place. So what does mold look like if you need to identify it on site? So when it's active mold looks very soft, spidery, squishy, fuzzy, velvety. It definitely has a surface texture that looks like wispy cotton, especially if you're looking at it under a microscope. And it looks like the slide I'm showing here on the spine of these books. That wispy cotton that you're seeing is called mycelium. It's thin branches of hyphae that are the vegetative state of mold. So those mycelia are present to help in the decomposition process that the mold is performing. So it is right now, when you're looking at this kind of mold, when it's active like this, it's actively digesting whatever food source it has glommed onto. And this is when it can be most damaging. So I mentioned active mold characteristics, that squishy, spongy, fluffy, wispy cotton look. Inactive mold characteristics, it's more powdery, dusty, dry. It's the desiccated spores, conidia, hyphae, sort of the bits and bobs of mold that has sort of dried up. So it's important to get rid of both kinds, as both are a risk to your collections and to the health of you, your staff, and your patrons. So mold comes in a variety of colors, and color is not indicative of species. In other words, if you see black mold, it doesn't mean that it's inherently toxic. You've heard the news, the toxic black mold scares that people have, that often people will talk about in buildings. The color doesn't tell you the species. Most mold I've seen over the years in collections ranges from white to green to gray. And this lovely example here in this slide even has a wide variety of colors. I think there's some purples and reds in there. It's very colorful, so I thought I would share that. And incidentally, the colors that you're seeing here in the mold are left behind on the paper or the binding or whatever it's reproducing on. It's melanin that's being left behind by the spores to help protect it from rival molds, UV light, temperature extremes, and free radicals. So mold uses melanin the same way our skin uses melanin when we tan, for protection from UV light. I found that out the other day and I thought it was really interesting, so I thought I would share it. So where do you find it? Mold needs the correct food, organic materials, and the right environment to thrive. Mold needs water, high relative humidity, and pollutants to germinate. High temperature can help mold to thrive, but it is not necessary for mold to grow. I mean, if you just look at the stuff that can go moldy in your refrigerator, that pretty much tells you that you don't need heat for mold to grow. And when I mention pollutants are needed, I'm referring to dust and dirt. Surfaces that are dusty and dirty are where mold will grow first. So seeing the mold in its original context is often helpful with identification. So the example I'm showing here in this slide, the mold is growing only on the surface of the box where dust and dirt would have gathered over the years. And dust and dirt also can contain mold spores, but it also can contain food for mold spores, like dead skin cells that have sloughed off of us humans. And when moisture is added to the mix, we have germination. And mold is also, it can be selective about where it will actually germinate. So here, you can see in this slide, it's a little blurry, but it's growing on this starch-filled cloth that was used to assemble this pamphlet binder. It's only growing on the exposed part of the book, the part that is exposed to the air in this example. So this happened because of mold growth that was happening inside an air handler, which was essentially spitting mold spores out into the library. But as you can see, the mold only germinated on the pamphlet spine because of the starch contained within the spine cloth on the pamphlet binder. It didn't germinate on any of the other book spines. So it was very selective about the mold was like, I'm going to grow here. There is food here for me. But there wasn't dust or dirt on, or in this case, starch on any of the other spines. So it only grew on the pamphlet binder. So where else can you find mold? Water damaged materials, obviously, enclosed containers that can seal in moisture. And this is a good example of that. It's not quite a container. It's a magnetic style photo album that has plastic sheeting that goes over the photos. So the plastic is basically has sealed in moisture and mold spores, and that has allowed mold to grow onto the page and onto Henry Kissinger there. So what does mold do to collections? So as I mentioned earlier, mold exists to break down and digest organic materials like leaf debris, etc. So when it starts to germinate on organic materials like paper, it will break down and digest the object. So in this example, you can see there's mold damage on this paper. Mold can weaken and break down papers even to the point that there are losses. And as mold digests, it leaves behind pigments and colorants, like I mentioned. That's why mold can be a variety of colors, but again, not indicative of the type of mold. So what is not mold? So there is this stuff called fatty SPEW. You can spell it SPUE or SPEW. I've seen it both ways. And you can find this on leather objects that have been exposed to the air. It's often seen on the spine of books like you see on the slide on your left. It has a very definitive crystalline structure that rises to the surface of the leather. It's thought to be caused by previous oil, fat, or wax treatments that were done on leather bindings in an effort to preserve them. And if I show you a close-up of it, you can definitely see that it's got this crystalline structure. It looks like tiny snowflakes or ice crystals. And fatty SPEW is completely harmless. All you need to do is remove it with a soft cloth. The object probably should be stored in an archival box to prevent the SPEW from reforming, since it's the environment that's causing the SPEW to form on the book. What are some of the early signs that you might be in trouble or might have the possibility of mold to start to germinate? Well, it starts to germinate around 48 to 72 hours after an incident involving high moisture, such as hot, humid days, flooding, and leaks in areas. Sometimes the presence of insects like silverfish and book lice eat mold as a food source. So if you see them, that could be another indicator. It also is an indicator that the area has high humidity as well. And of course, there's that telltale musty odor. It's sort of damp, musty, earthy smell that smells like a closed up basement. And incidentally, what you're smelling are the volatile organic compounds that the mold is releasing as it multiplies and grows. I know, yuck, right? This is why PPE is important. So if you suspect there's mold, what do you do? So one of the things you should do if you think that there may be a leak somewhere, you need to inspect your space. Whether the environment is controlled or not, it doesn't matter. There still can be microenvironments that exist that can support mold, like behind shelves where the air circulation isn't so great, basement floor storage in cardboard boxes like the picture you see on your left. Damp microenvironments due to the location of water. There could be sinks, bathrooms, cold walls, windowsills, leaks that are adjacent to spaces that might be causing a problem. And of course, post-water incidences where the drying did not take place immediately and was slow to be cleaned up. So mold prevention. How do you prevent mold from happening? So if you have an event, reducing and removing moisture is absolutely key. So it's really important to do things like avoid storing collections in damp areas like basements, keeping your relative humidity low between 40 to 55%. Ensuring that air circulation is continuous around collections. So having spaces between your bookshelves is really important, and not necessarily having them against walls, especially if it's a wall that is next to a bathroom or perhaps an outside wall, things like that. And when there's water damage, respond quickly. It's important to recognize that materials that can hold more water, hygroscopic materials, are more susceptible to mold growth. It also means that the materials will be heavier than before. I found this image and I thought it was really interesting. So this is from a water emergency in the Australian National University's Chifley Library. When books absorb water, they swell and increase in size, causing fun sculptures like what's happened here. They kind of all squished, like got big and bigger and then turned into this sort of roller coaster looking sculpture on the shelf. So what else can you do to prevent mold? Regularly change air handling filters, clean your ductwork if you've had a major outbreak, especially when you've had repeated outbreaks in a space. Isolate and examine incoming collections. So this is helpful not only for preventing potential mold infestations, but it's also helpful to prevent infestations from insects and rodents as well. And if you have a clean environment, the dormant mold spores will be removed with regular dusting and cleaning and not giving them a chance to activate and germinate. So things like Swiffer cloths, microfiber cloths work great for dusting, including the ones that are kind of made to replace feather dusters. I think they're like Swiffer dusters, I think they're called. And HEPA filtered vacuums are helpful. That means that the mold will be kept inside the vacuum and not be spit out of the back of the vacuum and back into the room. And that's really the only type of vacuum you should use to clean mold. So I'm going to talk a little bit about health hazards associated with mold. So I want to make this point pretty clear. All molds can pose a health risk, and some people are more at risk than others. So in terms of people, mold is first a sensitizer, which then can become an allergen and then can later become toxic. It is truly a person-dependent thing more than a mold-dependent thing. So those most at risk to mold being very effective by mold would be people with compromised immune systems, respiratory illnesses or asthma, people who have allergies to mold, mushrooms, or penicillin. Penicillin is actually made from a mold. So if people have penicillin allergies, they shouldn't be helping with mold outbreaks. So it's best to assume that all mold is a health risk. Then you will always protect yourself and others when working with it. So there are some species of mold that are toxic, but only testing is going to tell you what kind of mold you have. So there's one mold that's called Stachybotrys. And it's usually when people are referring to toxic black mold, that's the one they're talking about is Stachybotrys. It usually grows on construction materials, especially sheetrock, drywall, but not so much on our collections. So the only way to know if you have toxic molds is to get them all tested. And honestly, it's best to just say all molds pose a health risk and just save your money on testing. I mean, testing is the only surefire way to know if your mold is a toxic mold, but having to test every single species that might be growing someplace, just protect yourself, act as if it is, and then you will have only spent money on PPE rather than expensive mold testing. Because ultimately, treatment is going to be the same when you're actually doing recovery for your collections. If it's a large outbreak, say a room full of books, then you want to call in the big guns. And that would be a conservator who can then recommend what next steps to take. Now, don't immediately call a disaster recovery company without the advice of a conservator, because disaster companies don't always know what to do with cultural heritage objects. They're used to dealing with people's couches and rugs, which is very different. So again, if it's a large outbreak, insurance may be able to cover it dependent upon what the ultimate cause of the outbreak was and what your policy covers. So now is a good time to check that collections insurance policy to see what it covers. In general, these are the 5 steps that you should use to respond to mold. So I'm going to review each of these in more detail. And as I mentioned, staff with known allergies should not be involved in the response effort. But before you do anything, do nothing until you have your personal protective equipment. Things like gloves, you can use nitrile or latex for handling collections. If you have people with latex allergies, rubber allergies, then you don't want to use latex. Masks, thanks to COVID-19, I think folks are pretty familiar with the N95 particulate respirators. Those are the ones you should definitely wear when you're dealing with mold. Not the medical face masks, not dust masks, but N95 particulate respirators, because as we've learned from the pandemic, they do the best job in filtering out the most mold spores and things like viruses. If you have, it's pretty good to have things covering your eyes. You can have unvented goggles so that mold spores don't get in. This is like large outbreaks we're talking about, especially like getting the goggles and the protective clothing, like Tyvek coveralls, or at a minimum, at least aprons or lab coats. And often people wear bonnets or caps to protect their hair. So with the N95s, you pretty readily can find them at big box stores, at hardware stores, And probably now you can find them more readily on the internet, like Amazon, than you could before when the pandemic started. So, but if you have any sort of respiratory ailment, even asthma, do check with your doctor before wearing N95 respirators, because they do very much restrict airflow. So step one, we want to confine the outbreak. So for small incidences, isolating the affected objects. If the items are moldy but not wet, you can place them in Ziploc style bags. And if it's wet, wrap in wax or butcher paper, and then move the objects to a space that is not affected by the mold without collections. For large events, you want to use thick sheet plastic and duct tape to isolate the space to ensure the mold doesn't spread to other areas. And this includes also shutting down any air handling vents that may return air from the area. Large sheet magnets can be used to cover air ducts. That's a pretty handy trick to know. So the picture I'm showing here was set up by a disaster recovery company. They can create these sort of isolation booths, if you will, with plastic with a zipper entrance and exit. And for two, stop the growth. So for small incidents, we have freeze drying or freezer drying. The object of the game with this is to reduce the moisture content in the object and in the mold. Essentially, we are removing one of the components that makes mold survive. So you know how you wrap things to go in the freezer to prevent freezer burn? Well, here we're actually trying to make freezer burn happen. Freezer burn is when moisture is pulled away from the food and it dries up. So don't wrap up the books that go in the freezer. We want the books to get freezer burn. And for other types of collection items like wooden objects, you will want to check protocols on how to freeze those safely, as other materials will behave differently than books. And the equipment, you should have the capacity to freeze really fast, and the temperatures must be -10 to -40 degrees Fahrenheit to facilitate drying. And at these very cold temperatures, mold will be killed due to the ice crystals forming inside the spore. And as they're forming, they burst the cell wall of the spore. And that's how you really freeze and kill mold. So freeze drying, some of the pros, it's inexpensive. You have a freezer, you can just pop the things in there, works really well. It's good for damp and paper-based objects. And it also buys you time. You can put things in the freezer and take out one at a time to clean as the mold is killed and frozen for a long time. And that's one of the cons. It's a really long waiting period. It's like 4 months at a minimum. And it's not suitable for everything. And some of the damp paper, if your object is damp when it goes in, the paper may stick together. So for large outbreaks, this usually you can do things where you're basically doing the drying in situ. You don't necessarily have to move the collections out if it's a ton of collections. So you can do dehumidification in place. So it's essentially hyped up air drying, which is what you're doing here with large dehumidifiers. So if there's a water incident as well as mold, air drying isn't going to stop inks from bleeding, coated papers are going to stick, and distortion of objects can occur. And you can also secure a vendor or a company with access to large freezers to take in the collections to freeze the items. That also is an option if you can't do the dehumidification in place. So once you stop the growth by creating an environment that's inhospitable to mold, you want to kill it. So for small or large incidences, you'll freeze the items, the growth stops, and active mold is killed if it's cold enough. So as mentioned in the stop the growth slides, freezing at cold enough temperatures will kill active mold spores. As I mentioned, the ice crystals will burst the spore from the inside out. This only works on active mold. So as an inactive mold, it doesn't have enough water content to form ice crystals. But freezing is great because since it stops mold growth, it buys time for deciding what to do next. For really large incidences, especially when you have things that are wet, vacuum freeze drying is an option. So it's different than freeze drying. First, items are frozen, and then a machine, like the one you see here, reduces the pressure inside of the chamber, causing sublimation. So the ice, the frozen water in the books, goes straight into vapor, skipping the water phase. So you end up with less distortion in your paper materials if you get them frozen quickly enough. And this is really great for large amounts of paper-based materials like books and paper-based records, but not photographic material. And once the work is complete, the vendor can then clean the materials with HEPA-filtered vacuums to remove any dust, dirt, mold spores, or insect remnants, depending on what you're freezing for. And the same would be true for smaller incidences. You would be cleaning the object after the freezing process. Oh yeah, so I have to have this slide, the killing mold, what doesn't work, or what you shouldn't use despite what the internet tells you to use. So sunlight. So the sun is either drying out the mold or the ultraviolet light is killing the mold. And while that's good, the problem is that light is one enemy of collections, as it can cause fading and discoloration. And also remember the mold colors we saw in previous slides, that pigmentation is there to help it survive from things like UV light. So UV will kill some types of mold, but unless you're going to test the mold to find out what kind it is, you're better off not using the sun. And Lysol, while it kills a lot of bacteria and viruses, it only inhibits mold growth. It doesn't kill it. And regardless, you shouldn't be spraying your collections with Lysol. Chlorinated bleach does kill mold, but some molds can be resistant to it. Again, it is something that can be used to clean your bathroom and your clothes, but not to clean collections. And alcohols on their own will not kill mold. And in some cases, some solvents, like certain alcohols, can actually reactivate certain molds. So moral of the story, don't use any chemicals to clean your collections, please. Once we've killed the mold, we have to remove it. And what I mentioned, the HEPA filtered vacuum is the item you need to remove inactive mold spores. And as I've mentioned throughout this lecture, removal of mold is key to stopping the mold growth and from incidences from reoccurring. The inactive mold will need to be removed from the collections to ensure they're safe to be used again and also to prevent reinfestation. And once it's inactive, it can be carefully cleaned off collection materials, either using a soft brush to direct the mold into the nozzle of the vacuum, like I'm doing in this picture here, or you can use the vacuum hose and cover the opening or the vacuum tube with a screen or a piece of cheesecloth to prevent big pieces going into the vacuum. You don't want that to happen. And for non-porous materials, vulcanized rubber sponges work very well. Vulcanized rubber sponges, they're also called gonzo sponges. They've also called pet hair erasers. Those work really well to remove mold. And I think they're also called soot sponges as well. They have a variety of names. And when you're doing this work, you should be doing it in a fume hood. In this case, I'm not, but I'm wearing an N95 respirator. And we're inside of a tent that's actually being ventilated. So if you can do it in an isolated space with negative air pressure, or you could, in theory, do it outside on a still sunny day to reduce the risk of spreading mold throughout the building. I probably wouldn't want to do it, right out on the lawn or anything, but, some place where there's like some shelter and a table, you can sort of set up a station. Always assume that there is a health hazard around mold and wear your personal protective equipment. As seen in previous slides, mold does physical damage to collections, so any in-house cleaning should be done carefully by staff wearing PPE and a knowledge of careful handling techniques for fragile materials. And unfortunately, you can't really expect miracles in a lot of cases. The residual colored components will often remain in the paper. As I've mentioned, when mold starts to feed, it secretes these different pigments. And some of the colors often come forth as an influence of what they're actually ingesting. And others are from its surrounding environment or just its inherent structure. I mean, if you want to get rid of some of the colorants that happens, it really will require conservation treatment. And even then, that's not a guarantee. So I just want to mention, as an aside about removing mold, a word on disaster recovery companies. Don't assume that they know what's best for collections. As I mentioned, they're used to handling people's household goods. They aren't going to necessarily know what to do with artwork, artifacts, things like that. So it's best to consult with a conservator before having them handling your collections. And the name of the company alone is not enough to assume reputation. There are some companies that have national and international presences, but they are individually owned and operated. So while they may have to follow some of the protocols that are instituted by the overall company, they may not always follow the protocols that they would in another state or another town. So you kind of have to shop around a bit, which is why freezing is a nice option for collections. It buys you time to be able to do the shopping that you need to do to make sure you get the right group of people to help you. And if you want advice, free advice, you can call a conservator on the NHR, National Heritage Responders Collections Emergency Hotline, which is here 202-661-8068. And a friendly conservator will be happy to help you. They can help you with the vetting process, maybe what questions to ask, and also what kind of techniques you might be able to do yourself if it's something that's just one object, things like that. So I encourage you to write the number down and keep it around in case something happens. And lastly, number 5 in steps for mold, prevent reinfestation. You want to make sure you clean the entire space. Clean it with a HEPA vacuum, the soot sponges I mentioned, and if necessary, you can wipe down shelving with a solution of no more than 1 cup bleach per 1 gallon of water, and then dry the surfaces thoroughly after wiping them down. You're going to want to replace any carpeting, padding, furniture, wallboard that was moldy, and repair and replace any equipment or plumbing that may have caused the problem in the first place. And very importantly, begin an environmental monitoring program so that adding data loggers to your spaces will be able to tell you what your temperature and relative humidity is in the spaces. So as it starts to climb, the relative humidity, it may help you get an early warning about whether or not there may be a moisture problem in your space. So, quick summary. Mold needs organics and moisture to survive and thrive. Mold can be active or inactive depending on the environment, and you want to get rid of both. Protect yourself around mold. Personal protective equipment is a must. And your 5 steps to mold response: isolate the outbreak, stop the growth, kill the mold, or at very least, make it go dormant, remove the mold, and make sure that you prevent reinfestation. So my email address there is tara.d.kennedy@yale.edu. If anyone has any questions that they think of after the webinar, I'd be happy to answer them for you. Thank you so much for your attention this afternoon.